You're listening to the Music Tech Teacher podcast, episode number 44. Welcome to the Music Tech Teacher podcast. Music tech tips, lesson ideas, advice, news, and interviews, especially for music teachers. Brought to you by midnightmusic.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Music Tech Teacher podcast. I'm Katie Wardrobe, a music technology education trainer, speaker and consultant from midnightmusic.com.au, where I help music teachers use technology effectively in music education. Today I wanted to talk about techniques for creating your own resources. Things like presentation files for your lessons, which help you present and run the lesson more smoothly and effectively. And they might include things like text and images and audio files and video files. In addition to that, though, I'm also talking about things like worksheets and games and quizzes and other printable things, or things that you might keep in a digital format that you're going to actually use with students. And again, these might include images or text, even spaces for students to write, musical examples and things like that. And also it might be things like posters or other decorations for your classroom wall, or song sheets and other resources like that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the things that you can use to create these resources and some essential skills that you can learn, which will help you create any type of resource that you can possibly think about. Now, as usual, you can find information and links to all of the things that I'm going to talk about today on the show notes page for this episode, which is at midnightmusic.com.au/44. And that's just the number 44/44. Now, there are lots of ready-made music education resources available online. You can go to places like Teachers Pay Teachers and other websites where you can buy ready-made resources. And you might find that there are PowerPoint files and interactive whiteboard files and worksheets and other printable things. But there are some times where you actually want to create your own from scratch. That might be because you can't find something that exists already that meets your needs, or perhaps you found something along the right lines, but maybe it's too advanced for your students, or it's just not quite right, or maybe you simply don't like the way it looks. I've had that before where I've just found something which the content looks kind of good, but I don't love the way it looks from a graphic design point of view. And perhaps it's not clear enough, or it's not got bright colours, or it's not attractive enough looking. And there are times also where you want to have a file that you can edit in the future. Now, it's really not hard to make your own digital resources once you've learnt a few simple tricks. Now, I started teaching some of these skills and distilled it down to 5 must-know techniques when I started running an interactive whiteboard course a few years ago. I found that the focus really for the interactive whiteboard course became how to create these resources from scratch. And it occurred to me that you don't need an interactive whiteboard to create these resources. This is the thing that most teachers were interested in the course, and that you can just do the same sorts of things in PowerPoint or Keynote files as well. Now, once you know these skills, as I mentioned earlier, you can really create anything and you can get them looking really quite good. Now, before we get on to the skills that you need to learn, when is the right time to actually make something from scratch instead of going to look for something ready-made? Now, it can be time-consuming doing this. I'm not going to lie. It's not always super fast and perhaps not a good idea depending on the scenario that you're in. So my sort of decision-making process goes along the lines of, if you're going to use it more than once, especially 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times, yes, that's a good time to think about making something yourself from scratch. And if you're going to use it year after year, you might find that you teach the same types of units of work year after year. For instance, a 12-bar blues unit, or if you're an elementary teacher, perhaps you do Peter and the Wolf with your students every year. You might do a composer of the month type thing where You do that every year. You might change the composer each time, but the essential sort of bones of that unit of work are the same. Now, this is a great opportunity to create your own things from scratch, because once you've created it, you can save a copy and then just adjust it to make it a little bit different each time or update it. Now, to make life easier, the best thing to do, and it's really good to think of this from the get-go, is to use templates. Now, that might be a template that you've actually purchased or downloaded from someone else, or one that you make yourself, but I can highly, highly recommend making whatever it is into a template file that you can use over and over again. It truly saves so much time in the long run. You're not inventing the wheel each time. You're not doing everything from scratch each time. All the fonts are there. All of the borders or the layout is kind of there, and you can just adjust it each time. The first time it's going to be time consuming, and then all the subsequent times you'll find it so much quicker. Now, in terms of the software that you should use for these sorts of things, I've mentioned already the presentation style software options. So things like PowerPoint or Keynote if you're on a Mac, and also interactive whiteboard software, because it's pretty similar in the way that it works. Now, the reason I suggest using those is that you can position images and text boxes and other things like audio files or video files freely on the page. You're not kind of locked in like you are in a straight up Word document where things have to be line by line by line. I know that some software programs like Word do allow you to have a little bit more freedom over moving images around. But if you haven't already used PowerPoint or Keynote or interactive whiteboard software for these types of resources, I really recommend having a go, because I think in the long run you'll find it so much easier. And I know that lots of people who sell their products on Teachers Pay Teachers, this is what they're all using. Everybody pretty much is using PowerPoint. Some are using a bit higher level, sort of software like InDesign, but ultimately you need something where you can position things freely on the page. It just makes life a lot easier. So it may seem a little bit odd. I've suggested using this presentation software or interactive whiteboard software for presentations, but I would also suggest using it for things like worksheets and the printable things that you might create for your students to use. That may seem a little bit odd at first, and to me it was also odd. It was a little bit of a head spin to think, oh, I didn't realise I could actually use that software for a purpose that kind of wasn't really intended in the first place, but absolutely you can. And the only thing that you need to do to use them in that way is to really change the size and dimensions of the slide, the actual page that you're putting your information on and your images and so on. So if you're doing it for worksheets and so on, you would change the dimensions of the slide to be letter or A4 size. So in Australia here we use A4 as our standard size. I know in the US letter size paper is the standard. So you can work out what those dimensions are and set up your file based on that if you're going to use it for these worksheets. You can also, of course, change the orientation so that you're not looking at the sideways view, which is, let me get this right, landscape view, which is the normal layout for a slide or a presentation file. You can change it around so that it's portrait style instead. So I want to talk through 5 basic techniques for creating these resources. And once you know these, you can really do anything you like. And pretty much everything relies on just these simple 5 techniques. I'm going to talk generic instructions today. I won't talk specifically for one particular software program because they all work in a similar way. The terminology is pretty much the same, and often the menus are called the same thing. So once you know the generic instructions, you can really apply it to whichever software program you're using. And when I think in that manner, I find that it's much easier to switch between software programs because I think about the generic or the sort of the general approach to where I might find a feature or a function. So here are the 5 techniques. Now, the first technique is creating text, learning how to create text that goes on the page. Now, I'm going to guess that most of you have done this before in the past, and it's really not hard to do. Of course, you're going to look for the text button somewhere which allows you to add a text box onto your page, and then you're going to type into it. Now, mostly the text button has usually a little icon with a capital A in it. You can often also go to the Insert menu and look for Insert Text Box or something similar to that. Now, I found it when I first started using presentation software in this way, I did find it a little bit off-putting creating text in isolated boxes instead of typing on a page with paragraphs and bullet points and so on. I don't know why, it just was quite different. I'm totally used to it now, and if you're in that state still where you just find it a little bit weird and it's not a comfortable thing for you, I would recommend persisting with it, because I think in the long run you'll find that it gets much easier and it makes a lot more sense. So what I do is I click on the thing to create my text box. I will basically type into my text box, and I type freely. I don't worry at first about font or size or shape or layout of the text. I just kind of dump it all in there, and then afterwards I will adjust all of those things. Now, the thing to remember is that when you're using this style of presentation software, you often want to think about the chunks of text that you type onto the page, perhaps in little boxes, little bundles, little separate segments on the page. So you might not type the entire lot of text that's going to appear on one page into a single box. You might type into, smaller sections into separate boxes, because it gives you that freedom to move things around. So a title, for instance, is going to be on its own in a box, and then maybe there might be instructions for a student underneath that, and that would be in its own box, different font size, maybe a different font style, and you can move that anywhere you like on the page. Now, my recommendation with font sizes and styles and that sort of thing is to make a decision about what you're using. I would pick 1 or 2 fonts only, and this makes your presentations and your resources look much more streamlined than if you get carried away and use about 17 different fonts. It can be really easy to get sucked into all of the pretty fonts that are available, but it's really good just to choose maybe 2 different ones, maybe 3 at the most, and stick with those. So I often have 1 font for all of the titles and subheadings, and then I'll have a different font which is for the paragraph text. So that might be the instructions for the student, for instance. Now, sticking with those makes the decision-making process a lot easier when you're doing each and every single resource. If you just have a couple of choices, then you're not constantly making that decision over and over again. So it'll make the process a lot quicker. And once you're happy with all of these things, you can actually save these into your template file, so you're not even having to change them later on each and every time. So that is technique number 1. So that was easy, right? Technique number 2 is to learn how to add a shape or a line to your presentation. Now, these are sort of objects that you'll use, and you would use these in lots of different ways. So if you can imagine, perhaps you're an elementary music teacher and you might be creating some kind of thing which demonstrates beats and rhythm to the students. Now, you might have a series of 4 circles across the page, which are quite large, and inside each circle, which represents 1 beat, you might have a rhythm for that beat of the bar. So in that instance, you might want 4 nice matching circles going across the page, and so therefore to create the circle, you're going to add a shape to your document. So adding a shape, there would be lots of reasons for adding a shape to your document. It might even be to create a border around the edge of your page. So if you wanted a square border around the edge of the page, you would add a square shape to the document and resize it so that it fits nicely around the edges of that slide. Now, to add a shape to your document, and I'm going to guess that most of you have already done this before too, you can select the shape button wherever that is in your software. Select the actual shape that you want, usually from a submenu, so that might be oval or circle or square, and often line is in here as well. and then you click on the slide. Sometimes you might need to click and drag across the slide to make to sort of draw the shape itself. Sometimes you just click once and the thing appears on the page. And then you usually need to make a few adjustments. So you can resize the shape by dragging a corner, or you can move it around and change the color and change the size and even the thickness of the lines of the shape as well. Now, when you're resizing shapes, one ninja tip, and this also goes for if you've got images that you put onto your page, a ninja tip is to hold down the Shift key while you click and drag a corner to make the shape bigger or smaller. Holding onto the Shift key while you click and drag will maintain the aspect ratio of that shape, so it will keep the circle as a circle. If you don't hold the Shift key down and you drag, one of the corners, sometimes your circle ends up being an oval or a really flat, squished kind of circle shape. It's not often what you want. So holding down the Shift key when you're resizing any kind of shape is usually the thing that will maintain the shape of the shape. Now, if it's not the Shift key in your software that does that, it may be the Control key or the Command key. You might need to just test it out, but frequently it's the Shift key. So give that a go if you haven't tried that already. It's one thing that I've used for years and years, particularly good when you want to resize images. I see a lot of presentation files where images look kind of squished. People might look too tall or too wide, a little bit like those funny mirrors that you see in the circus halls and stuff like that. Keep them, maintain their aspect ratio by holding down that Shift key. Now, often when you add a shape to your page, it will be filled in. It will be a solid color. Now, if you would prefer it to be just an outline and you want to put something into the middle of that shape, you might need to select the shape itself and change the fill setting. So you can often select the shape and go into the part of the software which allows you to change the settings for that shape, and you would look for something like no fill, and it will take away the color that's filling up the middle of the image. So this is often in places like the formatting palette if you're using PowerPoint, or the inspector if you're using Keynote. And if you're on a smartboard and you've got the smartboard software which is called Notebook, it might be in the Object Properties menu. So wherever it is, you can usually use that to change the fill setting, and you can usually change the color and the line thickness of the shape there as well. So that was technique number 2. Technique number 3 is to learn how to add images. And again, I know that you've done this before. So an image could be a photo or a clip art picture. It might even be a chord diagram or some notation. So in the example that I mentioned earlier, where we've got 4 beat circles on the page, you can then add images inside those circles. So for instance, a crotchet image or a couple of quavers joined together or a rest image, and that will become the rhythm that the students are going to look at and perhaps clap in class. Now, there's a couple of ways you can add images to a slide that you're working on. You can either go to the Insert menu, if there's an Insert menu, and then select Image. Sometimes it might say Picture or Media. You locate the image on your computer and you click OK or Insert. Alternatively, you can find the image first in the Finder if you're on Mac, or in Windows Explorer if you're on a PC, and then drag the image straight onto the slide. Now, some people find this a bit of a challenge, juggling a couple of different windows at once. So if that's a bit difficult and it ends up being a bit confusing, go for the first method. Go to the Insert menu and look for the image that way. That way is fairly foolproof. Then once the image is on the page, you can adjust the size by dragging the corner like we talked about earlier and reposition it. And so once again, if you want to make sure that you maintain that aspect ratio, hold the Shift key down while you're dragging the corner to resize it. Now, one thing that I like to do is you can reposition images and other objects on your page with the mouse, but once you've selected it, it can be really useful just to move it very gradually in tiny increments with your arrow keys, so the up, the down, the left and the right arrow keys. I really like this because it can be a lot more precise than dragging with your mouse. I find sometimes when I click and drag with my mouse, I go a little bit too far one way and then I do it again to correct it and it goes a bit too far the other way and then back again. It gets a bit frustrating. So selecting it and moving just gradually with your arrow keys can be a lot easier. Now, if you're looking for images to use in your resources, I've done an earlier podcast episode where I talk about some great places to find images, including free, copyright-free, or public domain or Creative Commons licensed images which you're allowed to use. I've also mentioned in that episode where you can find notation images if you do want to do notation on your resources, and chord diagrams and so on. I've got some of those things on my website which I've created for people to use, and I'll link to all of those things in the show notes. This episode of the Music Tech Teacher podcast is brought to you by the Midnight Music community. The Midnight Music community is an online space for music teachers who'd like help using technology in their music lessons. There are online courses, video tutorials, lesson plans, music tech news, and professional development certificates are provided for any training that you undertake. I'm inside the community every day, personally answering members' questions and sharing tips and ideas. The best thing is that you get to connect with hundreds of other music teachers just like you and share your own experiences and occasional music tech frustrations. For more information and a special joining price just for the listeners of this podcast, visit midnightmusic.com.au/podcast offer. That's midnightmusic.com.au/podcast offer. Now, technique number 4 is to add a hyperlink to something. Now, this is a great thing to do if you're creating some sort of unit of work that you're going to present to students and you're creating a presentation file. It can be really good to add links into that document so that you're not kind of looking around for the website that you want or the video that you want to show and so on. Having a link inside the presentation file means that it's a much slicker presentation when you're doing that part of the lesson with students. You don't have to have a lot of things open ahead of time. You can just double check that everything works, and it's just there handy for you to grab hold of and click on rather than having to find it separately. You don't need to bookmark things and so on. Now, I've done this for a lot of years now, and I found when I prepare my presentation slides in this way, it just makes things a lot smoother, and I'm not keeping people waiting while I'm looking around for the exact thing that I wanted to show them. So to do this, you can basically hyperlink anything in your slides. And by hyperlink, I mean there's going to be some text which has a link, and once you click on the text, it'll take you to a web page, something that's online. Or you can even hyperlink an object on your slide. Depending on the software you're using, you can often hyperlink an image or a notation picture or something else to make it super easy to get to the place you want to go. So to do this, the first thing you're going to do is visit the destination, visit the web page that you want to link to, and you're going to copy the web address, the URL. Then you go back to your presentation software and you select the text or the object or whatever it is you want to create that link to on your slide. The next step is to just look for the words insert link or insert hyperlink, and it might be inside a menu called the insert menu, which makes a lot of sense, or sometimes you can right click on the object and choose it there. Many programs also use the shortcut Control-K or Command-K on a Mac, and that's kind of a universal shortcut for adding a link in any kind of document that you might be creating. So once you do that, usually a box pops up and it gives you a place to paste the link, and you can just add it there and save it to that place. Now, technique number 5, the last one, is learning how to embed an audio or a video file in your presentation software. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, this might be a time where you want to play a musical example for students, or there might be some sort of oral training exercise, ear training exercise that you want to play them or maybe it's a song that you're learning, or there's a backing track that you want students to sing along with. Now, you can put the audio file into the slide itself so that it's super easy to find and have on hand. Now, this is a little bit like those links that I talked about in the previous one, where if it's just there and it's within your presentation software, you don't need to look around for CDs or YouTube videos or through Spotify playlists to find the thing that you want to play. You don't even need to look through files on your laptop. You can just have it right there, and it makes everything really, really quick and easy. Now, embedding audio files and video files does make your presentation file overall a little bit larger in size. So it's just something to be aware of. It wouldn't stop me from adding these files in, but just so you know, if you end up with a presentation file which has embedded audio and video on every single slide, it's going to become a large file. And at that point, you might want to consider maybe splitting it into two separate presentation files. In PowerPoint and Keynote, you can embed an audio file or multiple audio files onto a single slide. Then when you're in presentation mode, i.e. when you're playing your presentation, the audio file will begin to play when you click your mouse. Now, interactive whiteboard software is a little bit different, and you have a bit more flexibility, and I love this aspect of interactive whiteboard software. You actually get the option to attach the audio file to a specific text object or a specific image that's on the slide. And then when you or a student comes up and taps on that object on the board with your finger, the audio will start to play. Now, this opens up a lot of opportunities to make some really cool interactive presentations that you can use with students. And unfortunately, you don't have quite so much flexibility in PowerPoint and Keynote. You just need to be aware of how each of those works, and then you work with it. So the latter with the interactive whiteboard software allowing you to tap on a specific object gives you like complete control over which audio files play at which time. And you don't have to play them in a specific order on one slide. So an example that I've made is a Peter and the Wolf unit of work. And on one particular slide, I found some images of Peter and the Wolf characters. So I had, Peter, the cat, the bird, the grandfather, the wolf. And when you tap your finger on each of those, it plays the theme for that particular character. Now, that's not something you can achieve in the same way if you're using PowerPoint or Keynote, but what you could do is have each of those audio files on the slide, but it's just that they will play in order. So when you're in presentation mode with your students, you would have to know that the Peter theme is going to play first, and the grandfather theme second, and the cat theme third, and so on. Now, to insert audio files, much the same as the other techniques we've talked about. You go to the Insert menu, you look for Insert Sound or Audio or Music or Media. They all have slightly different terminology. For instance, PowerPoint is, I think you go to the Insert menu, you choose Movies and Sound or Sound and Music, depending on which version of PowerPoint that you're looking at. For notebook software on a smartboard, you go to Insert and then choose Sound, and on Keynote it's Insert and then Choose. So they're all slightly different, but you just need to sort of look around for what your option is going to be. Then you search for the file on your laptop or computer, and in this case, MP3 files work the best because they're not too large. So if you are not aware, MP3 files are a compressed kind of version of an audio file, and that's what you commonly use or listen to on an iPhone or iPod or a smart device of some sort. WAV files are original audio files from an original recording, and they're much, much bigger. So just be aware that the bigger the file, the bigger your presentation file overall will be, and it just might slow things down a little bit. So I would go for MP3 files as the first option. There might be some options once you go to the Insert audio file and you have a box that opens up. There might be some options like when the sound should play. So you can choose to have it when clicked or as soon as the slide appears on the screen. And there might also be an option about whether an audio icon should appear on the slide. Now, I prefer the audio icons to not appear on the slide because I think it looks a bit cleaner, but sometimes you might want an audio icon there because it just shows people that there is some audio that's about to play. So you make that choice. Once you've done that, you'll click Save or Insert or whatever the option is at the bottom of the window, and the audio file will now be embedded on the slide. And it will play when you're in presentation mode. If you're using PowerPoint or Keynote, you'll probably see an audio icon when you're in that editing the slide mode, but it usually won't show when you're in presentation mode. Now, those are the 5 basic tips to learn, and really you can create almost anything you like using those techniques. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some bonus tips, and these are things that I've learned from creating resources like this over the years, and there are a few things where, man, it's made my life so much easier just knowing a couple of little tricks or techniques to help you create these resources quickly and easily. Now, the first thing is learning how to select objects. Now, that sounds a bit weird because we all know if you click on something, you have selected it, but that's just selecting a single item. The thing that is really super helpful is learning techniques for selecting items in a group. So they might be things that are near each other on a slide. So going back to my example where we've got 4 circles on the page, you might create one circle and then you might duplicate it another 3 times. So you've got 4 identical circles, but perhaps they're not positioned where you need them to be. Usually when you duplicate something, it just kind of gets dumped close to the original object and it's not nicely spaced out on the page. I'm going to talk about tips for spacing those things out evenly in a moment because that's another thing that is a time saver. But let's say you wanted to select 4 circles. Now you can click on one single object and then you can do a couple of things to select the others. One thing is that you can hold the Control key down, or Command if you're on a Mac, and click on circle number 2, number 3, and number 4. Now that technique is awesome if you want to select multiple objects on the page and they are perhaps not near each other. So you might have circles on, 4 different corners of the page and there might be 17 other objects on the page as well. So you don't want to select everything on the page, but you just want to select random objects and then do something to them, like move them all simultaneously or change the color of all of them simultaneously. So select one and then Control click or Command click on the remaining items. If your items are kind of near each other and there's nothing else around on the slide, you can do what's called lassoing the items. At least that's the term I use. I'm not sure if it's a global term that everybody uses, but essentially you can put your mouse near the items and you're going to choose a blank spot to start with, and then you click and drag your mouse across the items that you want to select. And you should see that like a little lasso will appear and it will select all the objects within your lasso kind of region. Now this really does work on most software programs that I've tried it on. So give that a go if they're close to one another. Those 2 techniques I use all the time and they are super useful. The last thing is that if you actually do want to select every single object on one slide, and this might be to move it all to the left or move it all to the right or up or down or something, you can select I usually click on the slide first of all just to make sure I've got the right slide activated or selected, and then use the shortcut Control A or Command A, and you should see that everything on that slide is selected, all of the objects, the images, the text, everything, and then you can move it or do whatever it is that you need to do to that group of objects. Second bonus tip is to make use of duplicating. Now, duplicating is an awesome option. That instance of 4 identical circles to represent the beats of a bar in music, you would create one circle and get it look exactly how you want. You want the right size, the right color, everything you want to be correct, and then select it and just duplicate it. Now there is a shortcut which is frequently used across many software programs, which is Control D, D for duplicate, or Command D if you're on a Mac. If that one doesn't work, And if it does something weird, you can just undo, Control Z or Command Z to undo the action. This is what I do all the time. I test things out and hope that it works. And if it doesn't, I quickly undo my last action. But if you want to go looking for it, you might need to go to your Format menu or Arrange menu or something similar and look for the word duplicate, or actually probably the Edit menu. That makes more sense. So find the word duplicate or clone. Sometimes it's called clone. And you can clone or duplicate that particular object. It's so much quicker to do that than to create 4 circles from scratch. You'll spend a lot of time fiddling and trying to get them looking the same and the right size and the right line thickness and the right color and all of that. So make use of duplication. Now, once you've created your 4 circles and you want to space them out beautifully and evenly across the page, you, of course, can drag them into position, and often the software has little guidelines that will pop up to show you that you have centered the objects or that they're all in a line together, and they are really useful. But before you even do that, I would highly recommend looking for the options which are to align objects or to distribute objects. I can't tell you enough how much this has altered the speed at which I can create resources just using these couple of features. So with my 4 circles, what I would do is have the 4, I've got one created, I've duplicated it, and I've got 4 now, which are all the same, but they're all higgledy-piggledy on the page. They're not in the right position. Now, go ahead and select all 4 of them, and then you're going to look for a menu which is like formatting. It's usually format. And then you're going to try and find, or actually sometimes arrange, then you're going to try and find the word align objects or arrange objects. It might be first, and then a pop-out menu might say align or distribute. Now, if you choose align, you should see some other options then to align all of those objects that you've got selected to the left or to the right or to the center or the top or the bottom or the middle. Now, you can use all of those options with different scenarios. So for my circles, for instance, I would probably use align middle. That's going to put all of my circles on the same horizontal line. They're all going to be aligned the same position on the page, essentially. Now, the second part of this is that I also want those circles distributed evenly across the page. So the first option is not going to do that. The aligning will just make them all evenly spaced, It will create them in a uniform position across the middle of the page. So that's a great step 1. While they're all selected, I would go back to that same menu, which is Arrange or Formatting, and choose Distribute. And in this instance, I would choose Distribute Objects horizontally. And what that's going to do is spread out my 4 circles perfectly and evenly across the page. You don't need to sit there clicking and dragging each single circle until they're just so, and then you click one and you go, oh, it's a bit too far, and now the others are all too bunched up or too spread apart. If you use this distribute option, it does it for you, and it's brilliant. So that would be distributing them horizontally. Of course, there's an option to distribute vertically. So if you want all the objects to appear in a line, one under the other, that's where you would do it. So vertically, obviously, will be in a column. Horizontally is like across a row. Really, really good. If you get used to using those frequently, that will save you so much time when you're creating these resources. I mentioned earlier, to make things look awesome, I can really highly recommend using limited fonts, limited colours, and choosing these things first and then sticking to them. Now, I struggle with this a lot because I like pretty things, I like pretty fonts, I like nice colours, and it can be really hard to just stick with one thing. There is a tendency or a need or a desire to use all the things in one single document, but it really does make things look cleaner and more professional if you use very limited colours and fonts. Stick to a colour scheme. I often go and look at other people's resources and use those as inspiration. So I see a font that I really like. I might try and find out what that font is. I might see a colour palette that I like. Having just 2 or 3 colours to choose from is brilliant. And it might be 2 sort of colours, and then you've got black and white in addition to those. Having just a limited palette of colours makes your presentations look really nice and clean and beautiful. Once you've decided, try and stick to them. Don't change them too frequently, and save that setup as a template that you can come back to in the future. I hope that was useful. I know it's a bit weird hearing these tips from a verbal point of view without seeing everything, but what I've got is a page on my website where you can see some examples of the ways that you can use these techniques. And it's got some things like the Peter and the Wolf thing that I mentioned. I've actually got an example on the website where there is a picture of Peter and the Wolf, and then there's a notation file which shows you the first part of the Peter theme playing. I actually created that theme in Sibelius and saved it as an image and put it on the slide. So it's just a really useful way to see the notation there. That slide also, when you click it, plays the Peter theme once you bring it up on the screen for the students. So that can be really useful if you're doing a Peter and the Wolf unit of work or something similar. It could be anything really, a composer or a period, a style of music. You can put these examples all into your presentation files, and it just makes the running of the lesson or the workshop or whatever you're doing really smooth and very, very straightforward. So I do hope you'll have a go. I will link to that page that I've mentioned where the examples are and the written instructions. You can download a copy of the instructions to take with you. And I'd love to hear if you do your own resources, if you've been doing that for some time, or perhaps if these tips are helping you out. I'd love to hear about that too. So that's it for today's show. If you'd like more help using technology, I'd love you to come and join me inside the Midnight Music community. It's an online space for music teachers to learn more about technology with online courses and video tutorials and lesson plans and personalised support. And it's a great group of teachers that are in there. Everyone helps each other out, and it's lots of fun. Now, I'm actually putting together a new course for that community, which will be out, fingers crossed, in February, which I think I'm going to call the Music Tech Bootcamp, Essential Skills for All Music Teachers. And it's going to be a course of general music technology tips, or just general technology tips, that I found that many teachers have never learnt because lots of us just did not grow up with technology. These are things that I've picked up, truly picked up just by chance over the years and stored them away in my brain. And I now share those in workshops a lot. And they are all things that I've just picked up. I didn't do any sort of main course. I never did a university degree in technology of any sort, and they're all things I've learnt on the go. So in that course, I really want to cover some essential skills that I think perhaps their teachers have holes in their knowledge with. So things like even the difference between audio file types and when you should use each one, and which iPad should you buy, and what are the ways that you can plug in a microphone into your laptop or your iPad, and all of those basic things that will help make life a lot easier from day to day. Now, if you want to join the community and get access to this course when it comes out, plus all of the other training materials that are already in there, you can head over to midnightmusic.com.au/podcast offer, where you'll get access to a special price just for podcast listeners. It's actually less than the listed price generally on my website, so that's a special price for listeners of the podcast. The Music Tech Teacher podcast is hosted by me, Katie Wardrobe. You can find more information and links from today's episode at midnightmusic.com.au/44. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.